worldview impact upon how we live our lives? And what does our current worldview say about our probabilities of creating systemic change? Today, I'm in conversation with Jeremy Lent, who's been described as one of the greatest thinkers of our time. He's the author of two really powerful books on the web of meaning and the patterning instinct, which explore how our dominant worldview has shifted over time and the impact that our dominant worldview has upon our culture and how it can lead to chaos, conflict, and crisis. Now, if we fail to zoom out and look at the bigger picture and what could be influencing our lives, then perhaps we'll continue simply to fight the most pressing and urgent issues as they arise, and the dream of systemic change may remain a distant and unobtainable reality. In today's episode, we're going to look at how we can start to think differently about our culture and our dominant worldview, and how simple shifts could actually lead us to break through of the polarization that keeps us from uniting together to create real change in the world. I'm really excited about this conversation. Speaking of a polarized world, it's inevitable in conversations like this that there'll be things that people agree with and disagree with. This is all part of the journey that we're on with Elevate. We're bringing different thinkers in to start to explore how we can really go about creating systemic change. So if you enjoy the conversation, please take part in the conversation in the comments. Please hit the share button. And in a world full of censorship, we're constantly facing battles of having our content sidelined by the major platforms as we push the boundaries of change. So please join us at weareelevate.org to join our mailing list and our private community where you can continue the discussion after this episode. For now, enjoy today's conversation with Jeremy Lent. Over the past couple of years, we've created over 500 episodes examining the political, cultural, social, economic challenges that have underpinned the pandemic in particular. And as a result, we've come to note several major challenges within those paradigms, and everything from culture to society, our worldview, philosophy, as well as systemic issues, the overarching dominance of corporations that kind of dictate how we live our lives. There's an undue influence over politics. And I'm fascinated to speak to people who have looked at these issues from similar lens, but perhaps from a different entry point. I've invited Jeremy on, who is well known within the climate circuit, looking at these issues and brings the depth of understanding. So Jeremy, it's fascinating to have you here looking at some of these what I would describe as core underlying factors that determine some of the challenges that we're facing today, because this is what I've been wrestling with for the last 2 years, is trying to understand why things are happening in the way that they are, and what is limiting our ability to change things, and why we're kind of giving up our agency. It feels like we've been giving up our agency for decades, and all the while major corporations are accumulating greater power, not only in their own right, but over politics and over the kind of grand narratives that we see through the media. So these are some of the things I'd like to explore with you today, but it'd be really useful to kind of kick off with firstly a context about your work today, and then I'd like to explore what led you to this work. So could you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing? You've written two incredible books that kind of explore our search for meaning. Could you explain a little bit about your work and what your primary focus has been recently?
Yeah, sure, Dan. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you today. So thanks for that. And my work primarily looks pretty much at what you were just describing. It looks at the underlying foundation for the massive meta crisis we're in right now, like where it came from. And not just where it came from historically, but where it comes from almost like a cognitive place, like the deeper structural foundations of that. So it looks a lot at worldviews, and it actually looks also at meaning, like the ways in which we make meaning out of the stuff that happens around us, which is really part of what a worldview is. So that of the two books you mentioned, the first book it was published a few years back. It's called The Patterning Instinct, and the subtitle of that is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And that book looked at this sort of really like a cognitive history of how humans have made sense of the world all the way from hunter-gatherer times, where we spent most of our human history, to the rise of agriculture and agrarian civilizations, to the basically the rise of the Western dominant worldview and how that's led to where we are today. And the sort of essence from that first book was this kind of simple statement that basically culture shapes values, and those values shape history, which is a different take than many historians in the sort of mainstream world have when they look at history. The ideas the different cultures, civilizations have, makes the way they make sense of the world actually has shaped the direction of this history. And the more recent book is called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And what this more recent book does is sort of takes up from the sort of historical path, looking at where we're at right now. And it looks at what is basically faulty and misguided about our dominant worldview that most of us pretty much take for granted. We just assume the world is the way it is because we're told that all the time from all different perspectives. And it shows that this dominant worldview is not just dangerous and leading us to a path of basically to the precipice, but is actually wrong. And it's scientifically wrong. And it shows how what modern science points us to is a different kind of worldview of deep interconnectedness. And one of the most interesting things is it looks at the ways in which the great wisdom traditions of the past, whether it's indigenous knowledge or Buddhism or Taoism, actually have pointed to similar insights, similar understanding of the world that modern science is now beginning to recognize.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested and curious at the minute to describe the kind of current worldview as wrong, because I'm always looking at things on a kind of scale. And
right, sure.
Could you explain what you mean by that, and how do we come to that conclusion?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that question of wrong. Wrong only in the sense in that it is, well, one is it's limited in its understanding. But what is wrong about it is it takes those limitations and it refuses to recognize them. So it says this is the only way to make sense of things. So there's a sense in which something is wrong if you basically have a model, and we can all recognize that a model itself is not necessarily right or wrong. It's either helpful as a representation of something else, or it's not so helpful. But where something gets to be wrong is if you look at the model and you mistake it for the reality. And so that's what one way in which I sort of feel the word wrong is actually kind of appropriate in that sense. But then it also ends up making sort of presumptive statements about reality that have been shown to not actually be correct. For example, from our dominant worldview, it's generally understood some basic sort of ideas like nature is driven by genes. Nature and evolution arises from selfish genes out competing each other. Or basically, in fact, nature is fundamentally selfish and competitive. Humans are fundamentally selfish. Nature is basically a machine that if we can understand, if we break it down into its little parts. Every one of these statements, what most of us, if we feel we're sort of absorbing what we're told, what the general wisdom of the dominant worldview is about, we feel those are just reality. Every one of those statements has been shown by modern science to actually be plain wrong, like incorrect, as interpretations of our reality around us.
Thank you for sharing those distinctions. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what led you to this work and finding meaning. I've been on my own path of finding meaning. It took a kind of an external intervention, an inciting moment that led me to kind of seek firstly my own meaning within my own life, but then more broadly ask bigger questions around meaning within humanity and starting to examine philosophy in greater detail and the kind of worldview that kind of determines how we live our lives. But I'm curious what led you on this path of the search for meaning, if you will.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And I also went through a major, basically like an existential crisis in my own life, which led me to that place. Because the first half of my adult life, I actually spent in the sort of business world. I got an MBA and ended up starting my own company during that first internet.com boom phase back in the late 1990s. And the company was successful, and I took it public as CEO. And then I went through my own meltdown. My wife at the time, she passed away some years back. She got quite sick, and I left the company to look after her. I left the company when it was too early in its phase. So the company started collapsing within a year or two. Meanwhile, my wife was going through cognitive decline, sort of borderline dementia. So I spent years looking after her before she passed, but I lost the person that I really was, the only person I was really close to in my life. So I was there kind of feeling alone, like everything I'd built around my life had melted down. But I was determined that whatever I did in my future direction of my life was going to be meaningful. And here's the thing, I wasn't going to take somebody else's word for what that was. I wanted to find out for myself what is truly meaningful. And that led me on this whole path of like an intellectual journey of trying to understand what are these ideas when we have these notions like my soul or meaning itself or God or a human nature or all these fundamental things we take for granted. Where do these ideas come from? And so I started like looking back through, sort of like peeling the onion on these ideas, looking back through history, and then looking sort of beyond history itself to things like cognitive science and evolutionary biology and anthropology to understand the source of our concepts about things. But at the same time, there was a parallel and related kind of embodied and spiritual journey where I discovered things like meditation and embodied practices such as Qigong and Tai Chi. And my path was that wherever I wanted to end up focusing my life on had to be not just feeling meaningful from this kind of deep way within me, but I had to really believe it intellectually. I wasn't going to do a leap of faith just because some guru said this is the reality and it felt right, like go with it. I had to really make sense of it myself. So this was my challenge to myself, my journey. And as I unfolded that journey, I was kind of looking for the books essentially that I ended up writing. I was putting these pieces together and saying, well, there's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. There's a bit missing here. Let me explore that. How does this happen? How did that happen? And as I started making notes about this and putting it together, I realized it could be really valuable both for myself and for others to actually share it in a way that was more accessible for others who cared about the similar kinds of questions.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry to hear the loss of your wife. The question I want to use to kind of follow that is similarly was not as traumatic necessarily as losing a loved one. In many ways, I went through a personal trauma that led to my own search of meaning. Mm-hmm. These are stories that I regularly hear when it comes to personal transformation. There's usually an external event that brings us to a point of leverage where we start to evaluate what's most important in our lives. And as such, a broader search for meaning seems to occur. Do you think this is replicated out across society? Do we need to reach to a point of breakdown or crisis before we more broadly enter into a shift of worldview? And has your analysis of the depths of history, and you really have sought out the puzzle pieces, does your examination reveal that to be true within society as well?
Yeah, that is a great question. And yes, I do think that we see a similar sort of paradigm working out in society as a whole. And what was interesting, basically what we're talking about is a like shift in worldviews. And maybe it helps for us to understand what a worldview is. Like basically a worldview is, you can think of it really like the lens through which we see the world. And worldviews are so powerful because most people don't realize they're looking at the world in a particular way. They grow up and they're told, they're not told explicitly. It's not like somebody sits down the little child on their knee when they're 5 years old and says, now here's how our world works. It works like this, like that. It's just they have a patterning instinct. That's why that first book is called A Patterning Instinct. We humans have this instinct to pattern meaning into everything around us. And that's the way an infant learns language, basically by relating all these things that she hears and touches and feels, and realizing there's this kind of pattern of language, which she then learns. Similarly, we learn the language of our culture. We learn how to make sense of things based on everything that we experience around us and values and the behaviors we see. Now, the thing is that what is so important is that once we realize we're actually seeing the world through a particular lens, it opens up the possibility to see the world through a different lens. But that's more to do with that sort of individual search. But for a culture as a whole, worldviews can be incredibly conservative, basically. They can last for thousands of years. Like in ancient China, for example, there was a worldview that lasted for like a couple of millennia, pretty much. And when you look at how worldviews change, you're absolutely right that we can think of them as like complex systems where they're very integrated and coherent, even if they don't make sense from somebody from a different worldview, but they all make sense within themselves. But then in a complex system, occasionally they go through what's known as phase transitions, where basically the whole system itself sort of decoheres and then goes through this transition of where it re-emerges or recoheres into a whole different meaning-making place, a whole different set of patterns. So worldviews go through that only when there's a major shift, either from an endogenous shift within that culture or an exogenous shift. So an endogenous shift might be, for example, when hunter-gatherers began to settle down and agriculture began. So in that case, it wasn't like people who were nomadic hunter-gatherers started to say, oh, we need to see the world in a different way. What happened was things actually changed in their life experience. Through sedentism, all of a sudden, property began to be more valued and hierarchies developed. And for example, there we see a shift where the worldview for nomadic hunter-gatherers is based more on this concept of seeing nature as a giving parent. Like from that sort of core metaphor of a giving parent, things like all people being family would arise, or all living things are a sort of part of that that same family and have intrinsic value. Suddenly, with agrarian civilization, a new worldview came of like a hierarchy of the gods, where just like there was a hierarchy in your local experience with fiefdoms and the chieftains or whatever, you sort of started to see the gods that way. You better sacrifice to them and ritualize your prayers, otherwise they'll destroy your fields or whatever. And we see an exogenous shift in traditional China, for example. They went through all kinds of massive changes that maintained the same worldview of basically seeing like this kind of really like an organic harmony, like a sort of a web of life connecting the heavens and humans and the earth. And then the West came along, and over just a couple of generations, they humiliated the whole structure in China. They basically forced themselves on China. And even though they didn't actually colonize China the way they colonized much of the rest of the world, new generations arose in China saying, oh, what our parents, what our grandparents told us is bullshit. Like they saw the sort of power of the West. And so they started to look around for a different way of making sense of things. And the only place they really had to turn to was the West. So they incorporated Western ideas, whether it was in the place of like communism, which they turned into Maoism, or then in more recent generations where they absorbed basically Western global capitalism. But what we see there is they shed the ideas because there was a kind of a humiliation, a breakdown in the structures that earlier generations had taken for granted.
So there's the length of time between these shifts is what's fascinating for me, and I'm curious because some of these shifts, when you describe them distinctly in the patterns and how they're different, you can see the real differences in terms of the way that they've unfolded. But surely this happens then over kind of a gradual, slow drip. Or is there a sudden shift? For example, a leap in technology that brings an acceleration to the change. What's been your experience of looking at the kind of cycles?
It basically does tend to happen quite rapidly within a small group. When you're looking at something like from nomadic hunter-gatherers to agrarian civilizations, for example, well, that actually was something that took place sporadically in different places over thousands of years. But in a particular region, you could actually see the shift happening quite quickly when that way of acting different way begins to pervade the values and the actual experiences of people's lives. What is interesting, though, like in China, you really saw that shift happening within a generation or two. It almost always takes there's almost always a generational shift because some people may be familiar with this notion of paradigm shift from this great book by Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions back in the 1950s, actually. And he looked at how this worldview changed with the scientific revolution in Europe, from the sort of medieval notion of the world to the scientific notion of the world, which I see as one of the major shifts in worldviews that's taken place in history. And what tends to happen, as he puts it, is that the sort of experts, quote unquote, from the old worldview, they're so embedded in their own sort of place of prestige and what they built their career on or whatever, based on that old worldview. It's very difficult for them to look at their body of work, for example, when they're in their late part of their life and say, I was wrong, actually. I agree. All these young people, it makes sense what they're saying. Forget about everything. I mean, not too likely that they'll do that. So it's a little bit like the old generation needs to die off in sort of, in his words, is the way he put it, while the new way of thinking can arise. But it can happen quite rapidly within a generation. And I see, honestly, what we're seeing today as this kind of shift, which is why this question feels so relevant, because we are in the throes right now of a dominant worldview that is leading our entire civilization to catastrophe. And we are seeing, in my view, a lot of young people, as they're entering their teens, as they're entering their 20s and becoming adults, and part of shifting things, they're looking at this, and just like the Chinese youngsters in the early 20th century said, this is screwed up what our grandparents and parents are telling us, saying the same thing. They're saying, we're inheriting a world that's falling apart. Why should we possibly take for granted what our parents' generation are telling us in schools? As we know, like people in the follow like Greta Thunberg's demonstrations, they're saying things like, why should I even go to school to learn how to deal with a world that isn't going to be there for when I'm a grown up?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to talk more about the young people shortly, but I'm also curious around the role of technology in shaping the worldview, in particular, within the work that I've done over the last couple of years through the pandemic, looking at grand media narratives and zooming out, looking at how this overspills into academia and into corporations, and recognizing that we essentially have a very small, not only a small number of corporations, but actually there was a TED talk around 10 years ago that calculated the percentage of the world's power that's held by, it's less than, people often say the 1%. It's actually something like 0.123%. It's ludicrously small number of people over wielding power through these organizations. And of course, many of these small number of people also own the media channels that we consume, but also fund our academic institutions. To what extent do you think in the modern world is our worldview influenced by those who have significant power?
Oh, it's massively influenced. I mean, exactly as you say. And so that is, I think, one of the things that doesn't get talked about very much, but this recognition that the way our media is so controlled by the billionaires really leads to this way in which it's very difficult for people in general to even have access to a different way of thinking about things. And it is absolutely structured so that the messages, the implicit messages that maintain the current system are the ones that get dominance and the ones that get heard, which is why it's so difficult for people to really even realize there is another way of making sense of things. So I think you're completely right about that. And, and I think it's important to recognize it's not just about technology that frames it, but it's about the actual core underlying system that this dominant worldview has created. The system of global capitalism is, in a way, I think, even more important than the technology itself. And what I mean by that is if we look, for example, at the rise of the internet, when it first began to become prevalent. And of course, back in those days, a lot of people were so excited by the possibility because you had the way that media used to work before the rise of the internet was you'd have sort of mainstream TV channels. And like, say, in the United States, it'd be these three networks, or in the UK, there'd be the BBC and the ITV or whatever. And it would be a very much centralized message delivery system. The establishment would determine what is news. They would tell everyone, this is the news. And people would accept that. Suddenly the internet came and it was decentralized. It was this way of like, great, and energy power can go back and be distributed to the people. So basically from a self-organized process, and our reality can shift. Great sense of excitement. And of course, what we've seen happen in the couple of decades since then is the opposite, in fact, and that the sort of self-reinforcing network effects have led to a few big hubs, which are driven basically by wanting to maximize profits for their shareholders. But this is why I think what's so crucial is it wasn't so much about the technology, but it's the context in which the technology emerged, which is the context of global capitalism. So from that context, what we have to realize is that technology can be absorbed and manipulated and actually then sort of restructured according to this capitalist driver of maximizing profits for shareholders. And a perfect example of that is if you look at one example of a use of the internet that remained distributed, that didn't fall prey to what we're talking about. And a great example is Wikipedia, which is this massively distributed information system where people from around the world engage together out of choice to kind of share knowledge, to share like this incredible collective human intelligence. It became like that precisely because Jimmy Wales made that call early on, not to try to be the next billionaire or Jeff Bezos type person, but to actually do something for humanity itself. And so you can see that the technology didn't have to lead to these kind of massive self-reinforcing hubs, but they did so because of the power of global capitalism.
Yes, yeah. I mean, as a result of that kind of self-reinforcing hub, as you mentioned, it's that the initial decentralization in some ways has still perpetuated itself in centralization, in the sense that the platforms that are utilized own the algorithms and the way in which absolutely, it's designed to maximize profit above all else. But I think you've given a good example of where things are done differently, but they've also existed within the same system. So within these conversations, I'm always torn between systemic change and rethinking the systems, which is a complicated idea, which I'll come back to, and the values and our virtues and our own individual worldview and how that is different, and whether it's the human condition that creates the system or whether it's the system that creates the human condition, and how interrelated they are, and where does it start, where does it end, and how we actually affect one without the other. What's your take on the relationship between the human condition itself, or our worldview, and the and the system, the operating systems of the world.
Yeah, sure. Well, it definitely is a complex feedback loop between the two, without doubt. But I think what we need to realize is that the power of the actual systemic meaning making is so vast that it tends to overpower the individual form of meaning making unless there is this conscious attempt by the individual at some point in their lives to kind of break out of that system. So again, if we look at this realization that as humans, what really makes us kind of uniquely human is that we have basically a more advanced than other mammals prefrontal cortex. We evolved in that way actually as a as a result of developing more kind of social intelligence through complex relationships with others as humans evolved in their unique path. But that patterning instinct also allowed us to kind of think symbolically, and it's that instinct that causes us to form meaning out of everything around us as we grow up. But the power of the culture is that it quite literally shapes the way we make sense of things. When I say quite literally, I mean that the way we work in terms of cognitive science and what neuroscience tells us. As infants, we have this massive interconnected set of neuronal connections, which kind of could connect in any kind of different ways. And what tends to happen is that the neuronal connections that don't actually work very well, that don't relate to actually meaning, they actually die off. And the ones that lead to rewards and the right kinds of activity and successful behaviors get stronger and stronger. It's called Hebbian wiring in neuroscience forms. What that means is that the culture literally shapes the form of our brain and our neuronal connections. But that doesn't make it inevitable that we can only see things in a certain way. What it means is that we are influenced strongly to see things in a certain way, which is why it takes a sort of a breakout to see things in a different way. One of the ways in which we can do that sort of breakout is when we begin to realize that there are different worldviews, there are different ways of making sense of things. But perhaps the most important way is, just like we were talking about in terms of both mine and your experience, our own life experience, that breakout tends to happen when we go through a major life crisis. It doesn't have to be losing a loved one or some sort of major existential meltdown or something. It can be simply a recognition of not being happy about life, of feeling that there's something wrong. And that can lead to an intention, a deep intention to be curious, to understand why am I not happy, and start to look at other and deeper layers of investigation. It can be as simple as that, but it requires some intentional shift at some point in a person's development to kind of break out of that cultural conditioning and look at different possibilities.
Yes, there's lots of layers that I want to explore more on here, and I don't know what order to do this, but I want to start by continuing to explore how the evolution of our worldview has led to where we are today, and whether there is a kind of general understanding or general belief that when a worldview shifts and creates a new cycle of worldview, that where once in many ways supersedes the other, whether it creates a sense of superiority to what it follows. Is there a sense that our worldviews have evolved in a way that's healthy and positive, and those that have preceded it have not been so healthy? And if that's the case, how true is that in terms of the reality?
Yeah, that is a great question too. Like, some people may be familiar with the integral way of thinking and the notion of spiral dynamics around that, which does have this sense of the sort of evolution of culture, and each new way of sense making transcends the previous one, and it tends to go like it doesn't leave it behind. It incorporates it and includes it, but then it sort of grows beyond it. So each one is this kind of growth phase. And personally, I think that's a dangerous interpretation in my mind of how we can see things in terms of human shifts. And the reason I call it dangerous is because it tends to follow very much the same sort of thinking that our dominant worldview has been following ever since it arose in Europe in the sort of 17th century, whatever, which it kind of sees the sort of what was basically the sort of white male European Christian way of making sense of things as being this the right one, the one that was that this is where evolution really meant to go, which led to a sense of superiority over other groups in the world. And that became a basis for things like white supremacy, things like colonialism and imperialism, and also the basis for what we might think of as human supremacy, the sense that humans are better than the rest of nature. Like we're smarter, we're the ones who sort of understand things in certain ways. So there is very much this, it's very easy to fall into this kind of paradigm of looking at evolution itself, all the way from first there were just kind of cells, and then all this evolution took place, and then humans emerged. And then, and this was this horrendous racist interpretations in the 19th century. Like they would actually look at people from Africa and they'd think of those were like earlier forms of this grand evolutionary process of white humans who are the ones who are at the apex. And spiral dynamics leads to a similar kind of conception. It always seems to be this white male who always seems to be the one who's reached this highest peak or whatever. So I think there's danger there. And I think it's better for us to understand that each worldview can actually offer something to us right now as we're looking at this major, massive existential crisis for humanity. It really is, in many ways, the greatest crisis humanity as a species has experienced since we sort of first left Africa and started to disperse around the world. And what we need to do at this point is look at what other worldviews can offer that can be valuable, that we can actually incorporate in a more integrated way of making sense of things. Not to say that that way would be better than others, but maybe that way might be more helpful for us to actually navigate the tremendous catastrophes we're looking at right now and find a way to a different way of meaning making. So from that point of view, we can look to indigenous knowledge. We can look to traditional Chinese thought. We can look to all kinds of different traditions, not to try to find some golden age. I'm not trying to turn things around and saying, oh, we've fallen. We need to go back to the noble savage because there was the people who made sense. No, forget all that stuff. But we need to recognize that there are meaning-making ways that got lost when we developed our modern dominant worldview that were crucially important and that actually modern science validates now in ways that we didn't realize until more recently. And through that, I believe it's possible to form an integrated worldview, one that does bring in some of the great treasures from past traditions, as well as the greatest insights of modern science, and which actually can lead us to a way of a different form of meaning making that causes us to relate to the living earth, to each other, in a way that actually can lead us to a more positive path.
Yeah, I think that's where the kind of integral process of bringing together things from different systems, different modes of thought can actually enable us to actually take some of the best bits from our history. And
right.
We've had some interesting conversations on the podcast recently, just in terms of the contrast between modernity and post-modernity, and how any one of those in excess becomes problematic, and how to harmonize within these different paradigms is something that's really interesting to explore, and that's led to kind of meta-modernity now in terms of an evolutionary thought process, or philosophy, I should say. What would you say then, having studied these kind of shifts in worldview over time, is absent today that was present within our history?
Well, in a dominant worldview, one thing that is absent is this recognition of our deep interconnectedness with all of life. One of the foundational precepts of our current dominant worldview is that humans are separate from nature, that nature basically is a machine. It doesn't have any intrinsic value, and that humans are there's a sort of essence that we have, which is that we are the thing that actually counts. And we get to see the rest of nature basically as a resource to exploit for human benefit. That goes under various names like anthropocentrism or human supremacy, or whatever you want to call it. But basically, like indigenous peoples from all around the world never saw life in that way. As I mentioned earlier, the foundational sort of metaphor for meaning making among virtually every nomadic hunter-gatherer group in history was seeing nature as like a giving parent, and seeing all of life around as basically relatives, as basically part of the same family. And that didn't mean that hunter-gatherers didn't kill other animals to eat and all that stuff. But even when they did, they recognized there was a spirit in that animal, and they revered that spirit. And oftentimes they would pray to that spirit, even while they were killing the animal, because they recognized that everything had intrinsic dignity in itself. That's something that has been totally lost by our dominant worldview. And it has big implications, because as long as we see the rest of the living earth as a dead mechanical resource to exploit, we're going to keep exploiting it. And we right now have exploited it to the point that it is crying out. It is actually losing the very richness and abundance that we humans inherited from what nature has done. We're undergoing right now the sixth great extinction of species since life began on Earth. And this is the first one that's actually caused by one species itself, basically destroying what else is around us.
Yeah. What I'm curious about here is if that is missing, which I do agree with, that, seeing the sacred in all things and the interconnection of all things. There was a great documentary series produced, or narrated rather, by Will Smith called One Strange Rock, which sees the world through space, through 8 astronauts who at various times spent time on the space station, but it examines the interconnection of all things on Earth. And it's miraculous to see how all things are interconnected, in real scientific terms, and looking at it through these lenses. And for the astronauts, it brought that kind of deeper meaning. It was, it's a true out of world experience. We can't send us all to space because that's not necessarily going to solve the problem. But that idea that we can have a greater sense of interconnectedness and the kind of recognition of the sacredness of all things, in principle, sounds very attractive and appealing. But to bring it in a way, introduce it into society in a way now that becomes authentic, because the hunter-gatherer who sees the spirit in the animal and blesses the spirit is still killing the animal. And in today's world, our destruction in the way that we operate, the dominance of corporate power, if each of those key individuals then just takes this kind of ritualistic approach to say, well, I'm blessing the earth that I'm destroying, it doesn't change the actual practice. We need to find, I think, a genuine and the difficult thing is, I've spoken to a number of people who have been on the show where there's traditional practices, whether it's breath work or yoga and things like this that have lasted for almost since the dawn of humans in different forms, even if they weren't given the same labels. But in the modern world have become kind of plastic, fantastic, throwaway tools. The story of the person who goes to the yoga class and then scorns at the homeless person outside the studio. Yeah. That's not a spiritual embodiment of the principle of yoga. Yeah. So we've almost got this throwaway culture when it comes to things that actually do offer us glimpses of opportunity to create a deeper meaning.
Yes.
So how in the modern world do we get that depth and authenticity when it comes to finding that interconnection.
Yeah.
What's missing? Because it's almost like a God-shaped hole. I was discussing this at lunch today, and I grew up in a secular family. I consider myself to be spiritual, but not religious. But I have a deep fascination with religion and faith, and an admiration for those who have devotion. And but I just wonder, is this a deeper void? Is there a void? The void you've articulated. How do we truly fulfill that in a way that is authentic, but also non-prescriptive? Because we've also seen the harms that can cause from institutionalized or centralized dogmatic approaches to virtue.
Yes. Yeah, I love where you're going with that. I think these are deep inquiries. Before I actually answer the sort of key question that you're asking, which I think is really great, I did want to just kind of correct one thing. Like when we were giving that example of the nomadic hunter-gatherer and killing the animal or whatever, it's important to understand, actually, because this is one of the sort of stories that our dominant culture has, and it's important to understand two things. One is that it is true, actually, when humans went through out of Africa to then start to pervade other continents, they did lead to mass extinctions of megafauna, of the big amazing creatures in Australia, North and South America, etc., which is one reason we have to be careful not to idealize our sort of hunter-gatherer past. But they also, as time went on, they actually developed ways of living in symbiosis with their territory in a ways that did become truly sustainable. And a lot of the ways in which they did that was through the sense of the sacredness in life. And so they developed practices that actually led over generations to deep sustainability. And I'm saying not sustainability in the way that they avoided destroying the nature as a resource around them, but that they actually helped to regenerate life around them in such a way that there was abundance that they could enjoy with others. So I just kind of wanted to get that clear, because that's
important. I know that's important. I kind of used it as an example to kind of illustrate how it could be a throwaway.
But then to come back to your key question, which I really I think is so crucial. I do think it comes down, ultimately, not just to this shift in the worldview that I've been talking about, but a kind of a deepest layers to a shift in identity. Because when we start to actually explore different ways of making sense of the world, it begins to actually shift our sense of our very sense of identity, of who I am. In our dominant worldview, identity is kind of quite simple in a way. It's like we are limited individuals. We're sort of separate individuals, and we're told to sort of see the world in terms of a zero-sum game, that there's us and there's the rest of the world, and my job is to exploit everything out there, be as successful as I can for myself, and maybe my identity will expand to include family or whatever, but it's very much about succeeding in that way and seeing myself as separate. But once we start to look at this different way of meaning making, which is also scientifically validated in terms of how our identity itself, as humans, we evolved to actually have more of a group identity. In fact, that's something that also got lost with the rise of modernism. What tends to happen is when my identity itself begins to kind of expand to also incorporate my community around, maybe those all of humanity, and ultimately to some point to expand to identify with all of life. That leads to a very different kind of shift. It's no longer that I'm doing my yoga as this kind of nice little sort of trinket that I just sort of put on my arm, and then continue to see myself as this hardcore individual, and the homeless person out on the street as completely separate. Once I actually truly engage in this process of expansion of identity, it does these deep shifts within us. And what tends to happen if you really approach these practices from a deeply authentic and skillful perspective, you begin to see these other people around you that are suffering, you begin to actually sense that and share that suffering, not in a way that necessarily there's an empathic way you can relate to that, which actually ends up leading to burnout. You can just, it's like so awful you can't stand it anymore. That's not so helpful. But you can learn skillful ways of a compassionate way of relating to what's going on, driven to this orientation towards engaging in trying to relieve the suffering around you. This is what true, really valuable spiritual practice, whether it's in Buddhism or other traditions, can lead to. And when we expand that to include all of life, which can be done in different ways, it can be done through internal practices, it can be done by simply being open to the rest of nature as we walk in the woods, and there's all different ways of relating to that. But when that begins to happen, something else shifts, because the actual destruction taking place on the earth around us right now starts to get felt internally, which can be incredibly difficult to handle, because, and I speak from experience on this, these can be some of the most gaping, difficult, and existential chasms of darkness that you can get into when you realize what's actually happening, which is why you need to turn to community to actually work with that. None of us can hold it in ourselves. But what's is interesting about it is that it leads, when we hold it in the right way, in a skillful way, it leads naturally to action, to engagement. Because in just the same way that, like, if you're sitting next to me and you start to hit my hand or whatever, I'll stop you. Like, I won't be thinking, oh, how interesting, my hand is hurting. I guess I should do something about it. I will react right away because I'm feeling it. Similarly, when our identity itself expands to include all of life, we are driven to action, not because we think we should do something because it's good for the planet or some moral idea, but it just comes from our gut. It comes from our heart, because that's what happens with our identity. So a lot of it has to do with shifting our very sense of who it is that I am and what it is that it means to be a human being on this earth today.
Yeah, I'm aware that we have a little time left, and there's some angles I'd like to draw out from this conversation. So firstly, I want to come to talk about barriers to this, because I kind of, what you've shared is I've had personal experience of as well, in terms of through deep practice, feeling a real intrinsic connection to all things. And I've had some deeply profound experiences in doing that through various different means. And that you can no longer see the world in the same way once you've had those experiences. But there are plenty of things, it's all very well in those momentary, was I still hold true to my previous statement. And in those moments, they're deeply profound. There are things out there in the world, and I describe Twitter as kind of like opening a door to a, verbal warfare. If you that trigger us into old patterns of separateness,
right?
And my sense is, when I ask the question around to what extent do these corporations dominate our worldview, I also get a sense that there is, described it as a machine to Indra Adnam, who's on the show recently. That they kind of know how to polarize that keeps people from actually ever, and whether it's by design or it's simply, again, the profit motive, in the sense that if you've got a polarized audience, you've always got an enemy. You can always attract people. You always attract people on team A if you're on team A and you're team B on the other team. So that then becomes a barrier to me in terms of our ability to find that interconnectedness, in the sense that is always available to us. Social media, the digital world, even the offline world, there are forces outside of ourselves that continually pull us out of our sense of connection and into separateness once again. And
very much so.
Whilst we can deepen our practice to kind of, and Ram Dass used to say he would meditate for 15 minutes before reading the news, so he could look at it, but it can be relentless, and as such, I'm, in terms of our grander awakening, I see that as a barrier.
Yeah. I think you're right, and yeah, I really like that you're raising these really key challenges to this kind of shift I'm talking about. And in fact, just speaking personally, I've actually something very similar to that. When Trump first got elected in the U.S., like so something like 7 years ago or whatever. I found it was impossible for me to just wake up and look at the news. It was just too traumatic. So I started actually doing just a brief meditation every morning, which I've done ever since. And it is a wonderful way to actually begin to open up to then relate to what we see around us. But I think what's critical to recognize is exactly what you're saying, that we may have some kind of moment of great insight, a moment that feels like an awakening, or a sense of, oh yes, I get it. And my whole identity has expanded to something so much vaster. And oftentimes we think, okay, I've got it now. But it's not about that moment. It's about integrating that moment into our future daily lives and our activities and our behaviors. And that's where practices, skillful practices, get to be so important. I do believe that a meditation practice is one of the most important things anybody can do. For most people, at least, that can work very well. But very important is, in my view, a meditation practice that leads towards that sense of compassion, compassion meditation, and expansion towards recognizing our identity, going beyond ourselves. And I think it's also crucial to seek out those around us who do seem like they're sharing that sense of understanding, because who we relate to, who we actually spend time with each day, actually also affects our identity. This notion of this deep interdependence and the expansion of our identity beyond our separate identities actually has the implications that who we relate to actually becomes part of us. This is almost like our spirits intermingle. So that's a key point. But I think maybe the most important thing I could offer people, that I found the most crucial lever for myself, is to practice kindness, both to those parts of myself that don't seem to fit with all those kind of higher levels of understanding or whatever, and to others around us. Because kindness, the wonderful thing about kindness as a practice and as a sort of faculty that we have, is it's always available to us. You know, we might want to feel love for all, but we don't necessarily have that available. We might want to be in harmony with everything. We kind of lose that. But every time we find ourselves in these difficult moments, every time we look at that Twitter feed and get all riled up, and then maybe respond in a way that continues to exacerbate the polarization or whatever, we can do that. And then we can, if we can have that moment of self-awareness, oftentimes that moment of self-awareness gets caught up in self-recrimination. Oh, I screwed up. Present, and then we continue to reinforce those negative cycles. But when we apply kindness at that moment, it allows us to soften and realize that there are parts of us that have been conditioned. There are parts of us that developed in our childhood as ways of trying to relate to trauma in our own lives, in our own families, and whatever it was that we were dealing with, that hardened us and caused us to then maybe incorporate some of these destructive values from our dominant worldview within us. But when we apply kindness to us, it can soften those areas. And the incredibly valuable element about that is that when we begin to do that as a matter of course, it's a little bit like if you go into the gym and you work out every day, naturally your muscles get stronger. Similarly, if we apply kindness within ourselves every day as a general practice, it becomes more natural, and then we can apply it to others. And then when we see that Twitter attack, or we see these messages of hate or whatever by people that we see as politically on the other side, rather than see them as other, see them as bad people and ones that we need to overcome or whatever, we can begin to recognize the suffering that those people have undergone in their own internal life systems that cause them to have come to these places of hardness and anger and rancor and attack and all the rest of it. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't push back against when people are doing things that are wrong and protect those that are being under attack. But we can do it in a way that doesn't actually add to the polarization. We can do it with a form of what has been called revolutionary love, the sense of actually recognizing that there is something to love in all of humanity, and even the people who seem to be the enemies, who seem to be like just out there to destroy the world. But loving doesn't mean being softer and allowing them to actually trample on things. It means responding to them in a way that is always recognizing there's some possibility there of shared humanity, that there is some, that within every one of these people, and every one of these Donald Trump folks or Boris Johnsons or all these people out there, they were all once little infants that basically just wanted warmth and comfort and love, but they didn't get it. And as time went on, they began to learn, oh, if I'm going to be successful in this world, I need to be this hardcore bastard or whatever. And then they began to develop it, but that's still within them. And approaching them in that way, actually, in my view, is the only way we're going to get to the kind of transformation we need. Because even if enough people on one side of the political spectrum got to be strong enough to sort of overthrow the people on the other side, if we do it in the sense of, okay, we're up, they're down, we've won, they've lost, it just exacerbates and continues that same divide, that same sense of othering, the same sense of separation that has caused these problems in the first place. That, I think, is key, is to really look at what we share with all around us and to come at each of these places, both within ourselves and with others, with that sense of kindness and compassion and true caring.
Thank you, Jeremy. I mean, I share that sentiment, and I call it the boomerang effect. You know, if we want to create a change in the world, we don't create that change by throwing more anger and hate into the world. It just comes back and hits us at some point. And but that is, I agree with the sentiment. Again, it's sometimes more difficult in practice.
Absolutely.
I mean, I find it particularly challenging. I considered myself perpetually politically homeless. I've always been a lone wolf politically, which, as someone who creates a podcast, it means I can sympathize, but also find frustrating things irritating on all sides of the political paradigm. And I can say things on, I can be talking to a left-leaning guest and the people, my audience who are leaning to the right will be like, ugh! And then vice versa. So I've always got that problem, but I try, it hasn't come from integral thinking. It's just come from an understanding early on that actually I want to be able to lean into all of these different views and recognize that actually they all have a role to play. And actually, there is empowering and disempowering ways of those political paradigms playing out, and it's when we're pushed to the edges of the bell curve that they start to play out in disempowering ways, and that for me is also a reflection of the way that we show up. But it can be very hard. People that we can get triggered very easily and go into defense mode, and that all comes from that sense of separateness again. It comes from our own inner sense of loss of love that perhaps we experience in the same way. So to me, it becomes very difficult because here's where things get, I don't know if we can just answer this final question because we're right at time, is the sentiment of the inner change. I talk about being the change you want to see. I borrow the phrase, and because if we can see that the systems that we're currently focused on are coming from a place of historic trauma that is playing out a certain way, then we have to be willing to look at that trauma within ourselves. We have to be willing to look in the mirror and do the inner work ourselves and be the change we want to see in how we operate. But then, people say, come on, Dan, how are we going to, how are we going to change this? You can't just look inside. We've got to, but the moment we start to look outside is when we're drawn into that anger, rage, frustration, despair, we get and we hype up the energy, and actually I often find that those trying to create change, including myself, when we enter into that energy space, we actually create as much harm as we do good, because there are many causes that I've been aligned with in the past that I'm no longer aligned with because the energy has got so intense that it's no longer an environment I want to be part of. I do recognize that there is a need for that energy, and it has to have an expression. I've been to tons of protests in the last 2 years, and it's very cathartic. It's releasing. But if we don't come back to that sense of balance, my thinking here is if we try to create the new systems and the new world view from that place of frustration and anger, then we're just gonna inject it straight into the future. So
yes, I think that's all true, and I think that one way to get at that is to actually, to some degree, sort of break down the kind of inner outer duality, that we're describing. Does the change begin within, or how do you apply it to without? But if we think of identity itself, to simplify it, we can almost think of kind of three layers of our identity. There is, of course, stuff within us, and then there's also our community, and then there's also these sort of greater political systems. And I think what's important is to realize that this kind of transformation we're talking about, it kind of needs to happen in each of these three layers.
Yes.
And each one is not separate from the other, but actually is interdependent, and has sort of feedback loops with the other. So it doesn't necessarily help for me to go and spend 10 years in a cave, like, really finding some sort of true place in myself and sort of go back to the world and think I'm going to then bring this enlightenment to the world. That's actually not what happens. As soon as I get back to the world, it's like, oh my God, and you kind of withdraw. And similarly, if we have some of these issues within ourselves, getting involved in political protests, like you say, will only exacerbate actually some of the negative drivers. But if we actually, and this is not easy, it's a challenging thing to do, but I think that it's the way which is most worthwhile, is to actually be in each of those three layers of identity, and at the same time, and look at the ways in which some of these fundamental precepts of compassion and interconnectedness, and harmonizing with others, and there are sort of core sort of principles that can be applied, that can work in the community layer, that can work in the way we engage politically and in the way we engage within ourselves. And we can kind of work through those. So we sort of go from one layer to the other. So the transformation ends up being like this truly systemic transformation at all different layers, working together rather than one versus the other.
Yes, that's what excites me the most, Jeremy. So I think that's an inspiring message that we can land on. I want to thank you for this exploration today. It's important that the work that you're doing is so important, the search for meaning, and through your books, the Patterning Instinct and the Web of Meaning. I would encourage our listeners to check those books out. Very, very insightful, profound, even I would go as far as saying, and will help give greater context to this conversation that we've packed a lot into in an hour, but there's a lot more to unfold. So, Jeremy, I want to thank you for being here. In terms of your current work, like ourselves, I know you have the Mighty Networks as well. For people to find out more about what you're doing and to learn more about your current focus, where are the best resources to send people to?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, I mean, I have a website, which is just at jeremylent.com. But as you say, there's a network that I helped to just kick off just earlier this year. It's called the Deep Transformation Network, which actually really is just inviting everyone from around the world who looks at these issues in our society right now, realizes that we do need transformation at the deepest layers, and wants to engage in that and engage in this kind of global conversation for how to make that happen. That's basically what this network invites. And it's really like just taken off in just a few months. And so I do invite people to join it. And I would love, like, these Mighty Networks are so wonderful, but what I don't like about them is that they're separate silos.
Yes.
And so, one of the things that I always want to encourage is for those of us who are part of these separate networks, is to encourage this kind of interconnection between them, so that people can feel that it's not like they don't have to choose between one home versus another, but they're all parts of this interconnected network effect towards the transformation we need.
Thank you for tuning in to today's powerful conversation with Jeremy Lent. clearly someone who has invested an awful lot of time and effort to understand the history of how our dominant worldview has shifted over time and the impact that these cultural norms have upon the way we live our lives, but more importantly, signposting how our dominant worldview can be creating some of the chaos and the conflict that we are experiencing, and how cycles through history can be potentially altered if we change our thinking. It's certainly been food for thought for me. Please let us know what your thoughts are in the comments. This, to me, has been one of our most interesting episodes so far on the concept of our culture, society, and how it is shaped. Starting to understand some of the root cause elements of the situations that we find ourselves in today. Now, in order to keep up to date with our latest content, please join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast. Simply add your name and email, and it helps us to circumnavigate the inevitable censorship as we push boundaries with our content. So please do so. Take a moment of your time to do that and join our mailing list. Our next piece of content on Monday coming up is our conversation around the cost of living crisis. We're going to be primarily focused on the UK, but more broadly looking at the deep-rooted issues that are underpinning the cost of living crisis at this moment in time. What are some of the causal factors and what can be done about it? So look out for that on Monday. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you very soon on the Elevate podcast.